doing that.
Thanks, Stephanie. Welcome, everybody. I just wanted to say a few words about why I chose this topic, and then I'll hand over to my MBA director, Vicky Browning. I chose this topic because leadership continually came up as a topic within my MBA, but it's one of the harder ones to really capture what's going on and how we need to perform as leaders, because it's changing all the time, and it is a softer skill. And with the business world becoming more complex and more interconnected, I felt this was a really good topic to do a refresher on. So I'll hand over to Vicky Browning now, who's going to interview our guest lecturer.
Thanks, Davina, and welcome to everybody to this webinar. As Davina says, I'm the MBA director here at QUT, and it's with great pleasure that I welcome Mary. Mary is the Howard Hawks Chair in Business Ethics and Leadership at the University of Nebraska, and Mary's been researching in the area of complexity and is really engaged in looking at leadership within the complex business world, and particularly looking at changing the language of leadership and how we think about leadership. So welcome, Mary, and thank you for your time. And so really, Mary and I were discussing this webinar, and as I said, one of the things we talked about was you often in the conversations we have is about you feel really a strong sense of looking at a new language for leadership. So what do you mean by that?
So that's really my passion. My passion is to try to get us to think about leadership differently. And the reason is because the models that we have for leadership were generated over a century ago. So they began around the late 1800s as we were moving into the Industrial Revolution. And they were for a different era, for different needs. They were trying to focus on issues of manufacturing, trying to manage low-skilled workers and semi-skilled workers. I recently had the opportunity to watch our public television station. They had a profile of Henry Ford, and they were showing how Henry Ford was trying to create the whole idea of assembly line and mass production. And so none of these things even existed. We didn't have factories, we didn't have organizations, we didn't know what, the basic things like organizational charts that we take for granted today, they didn't have any of that. So they were trying to figure out bureaucracy and management and organizing systems. And that's where our current leadership models have come from. But as we know, we're in a very different age and era, and so the needs are different. So we're going through a paradigm shift. Everybody knows that. But what hasn't transitioned very well is leadership. And people will say to me, well, why do we need to do it in leadership? If we don't do it in leadership, people who are in these leadership roles aren't going to understand that they need to change the way that they do things. So I really believe that until we get new models appropriate for the knowledge era and appropriate for this age, we're going to continue to fumble and stumble our way through. And we've been studying management, we really need to start talking now about leadership.
So what do you think is different about the context in which we now meet? I mean, you talked about the industrial era and how those management models came in. So obviously you've got a sense there's a lot has changed, obviously, in the last 10, 20 years. So what is your sense about what's changed?
So what's changed is we're in complexity. And I think everybody in this webinar knows complexity, right? Because they're all alums of the program and have been studying complexity. And Vicky showed me the beautiful sign out here on the wall with complexity right in the center of it. So I think everybody understands that we're in complexity. But why is it happening, and what does that really mean? It's happening because the world is more interconnected. So we're connected on a level that we've never been before. And that changes the nature of control. In the past, we were able to control things. So bureaucratic systems and structures, they're premised on the idea of hierarchy, authority, and control. But in a connectionist world, that doesn't work quite so well. So it's becoming more important that we think about leadership beyond control, and that there are ways that we can get things done without having to rely on the bureaucratic control. There was an IBM report, I think I have it in the slides here, let's see if I can get this going. So, oh, we lost the picture, does that matter? I lost us. Okay. So we're in the age of complexity and capitalizing on complexity. In 2010, IBM put out their global CEO study. And they do this biannually. So up to this point, they were talking about things like change. So you would see all the stuff we see around change, the importance for top leaders to drive change. But something fundamentally different happened in 2010. In their report, they said we need to capitalize on complexity. And when I read the report, I thought, did they really get complexity, or did they mean complicated, like the traditional way of thinking about it? They did mean complexity. They said essentially we're in a global system of systems. The world is it's an unprecedented level of interconnectivity, and that we can't control in the same way, so we need to think differently about how we lead in this situation. Well, why did that happen? Why in 2010 are they talking complexity?
Do you see?
The global financial crisis. In 2008, the global financial crisis hit, and what happens after that? All these companies around the world are at the mercy of it. So they realize we can't control. Now, the other interesting thing about this study is that they said in there that all of the CEOs agreed that complexity was their #1 issue. But over 50% of them said that their companies were not prepared to deal with it. And if it was over 50%, I'd say it's even higher. So they don't know what to do about this. And that's why we need new models and new ways of thinking about it. Their answer was we need to do creativity. And I say, yes, that's right in some ways, but it's not the full story.
Yeah.
So they know, they then recommended in this report that we go to creativity and creative leadership. But creativity is not going to get us there. We really need to go to full complexity and talk about how we can design organizations as complex adaptive systems.
So, I mean, you say that the current traditional models don't really address this complexity. I mean, what is it about them, and what are you proposing that leaders think about, or the approach they take to be able to work with this complexity?
So the current models, because they're premised in hierarchy and control, what they focus on is standardization. They focus on efficiency. They focus on results. And what that does is it stifles out the creativity. So I'll show you some pictures that I've put together, some slides based on some research that we've been doing. What we know about complexity is that it takes complexity to be complexity. So what you need from complexity is an adaptive response. So if you look at this slide, what you see is 3 different kinds of regimes. You have an ordered regime, a complex regime, and a chaotic regime. And it's based on the variety of stimuli and the variety of responses. So the stimuli from the environment, if we just make that complexity is increasing. And we need to be in higher levels of this. But what's happening in organizations is that managers respond with order. So what we should be is here, where we're responding to complexity with complexity. We should be on that diagonal line. And we should be enabling organizations to address complexity and be in the complex regime. But when the organizations are faced with complexity, they drive it to order. And why do they do that? They do that because this is what our traditional leadership models tell them to do. They're all about driving to order. So it's not only that the managers do this because the models tell them to, employees do it because they want order from the managers. When we're dealing with complexity, there are a lot of people who don't like it, and so they want to simplify, they want to take it out of the system when they actually should be putting it into the system. So this is the basic idea of our complexity leadership model, is that there's the hierarchical bureaucratic system, which are the circles you see in the background. And then you need to have complex adaptive systems. So you need complexity in the organization. So these little network things are little casts that are happening in the organizations. They're pockets of complex adaptive systems and dynamics. When they respond with order, adaptive dynamics are suppressed. And so it drives out the complexity in the system. It goes to alignment and to control, to standardization that drives out complexity. And this is the response that predominant leadership approaches are most often creating. So that's the problem.
So, I mean, so in complexity leadership, really what we're looking at is perhaps enabling what you called dynamics that really mobilize people, and perhaps looking at a different way of leadership. So what was your thoughts around that?
So what we need to do, instead of an ordered response, is we need to get to an adaptive response. So I want to just lay out for you the basic model that we have now for the complexity of leadership theory. We've done some development on it, and we have some different needs for the components that we had before. So I'm not going to go to what was there before because I don't want to confuse you, but essentially what we're saying now is that there are two kinds of systems in organizations. There's an entrepreneurial system, and the entrepreneurial system is responsible for innovation, or for creativity, for new ideas, for learning. And then there's an administrative system, which is really more responsible for getting things done. So that's driving efficiency and results, and that's the bureaucratic system. Now, every organization starts out entrepreneurial. So any organization that has begun has had just to grow to be entrepreneurial. But when they become, either when they go public or when they become formalized, they bring on the administrative system. And as soon as you bring these two things together, they're in battle. So you have an entrepreneurial system and an administrative system in battle with one another. Now, you can take a guess at which one wins. When entrepreneurial and administrative go into battle, who wins? Administrative. It's what I've set out every time. And so what's happening is that the administrative is working to snuff it out. That's the ordered response. Now, part of it is that what we discovered in our work is I started with an anti-administrative, anti-bureaucracy bias. So I didn't like administrative systems. I thought we didn't want them at all. But what we discovered was that actually it's the tension between the administrative and the entrepreneurial where the creativity is generated. So that's where we can get the adaptive response. These two things together. So if you just get innovators and they've got all these ideas and they want to do things, that's no good unless you have the constraints of the administrative system around it. The administrative without the entrepreneurial is no good either. So these two things have to work in collaboration with one another, but they do it in tension. And what organizations try to do with an ordered response is wipe out that tension. So that's the problem that then snuffs out the entrepreneurial system and the adaptive stuff. So what we need instead is an adaptive response, and what an adaptive response does is it operates in that tension. Creative tension is critical to complexity. And so you need to have an adaptive system that operates in these two things that then drives, as you say at the bottom of the slide, drives emergence for the organization. So the difference in the adaptive response is that you have what we call the missing piece in the middle. All organizations have entrepreneurial. Even if it's been snuffed out, it's still there. And the reason is because people in organizations still want to be entrepreneurial. So people still have ideas. And we can get organizations that are really bureaucratic, that have people not doing a whole lot of ideating. But the fact of the matter is people will. So it's like we still have brains in our heads. We're still doing that. So it's always there to some extent, or can be there. Administrative is always there once we get the bureaucracy going. But the adaptive system in the middle is the piece that's missing. So we describe this as the missing piece in an organization. This is the real key to make an organization a complex adaptive system and to try to get these adaptive responses. And so it has to operate in the tension.
So what is the difficulty of operating in this adaptive area? I mean, this must be quite a challenge for leaders. So that's the first part of my question. The second part of the question is what actually are leaders doing there? So probably the first part is, what are the challenges they face? Because most organizations are strongly in the administrative system. And a lot of young leaders come to me and say to me, oh, that's all very well, I'm running a team or running a division, but actually, I work in this bureaucracy, and how can I make a difference, or how can I release that entrepreneurial system?
That's right. So the difficulty is that we don't know much about the adaptive system. So because we've never studied it, all of our leadership research has been in the administrative system. So it doesn't mean we don't need what we know from leadership research because we still have administrative systems, but we've never studied either the leadership that occurs in the entrepreneurial or in the adaptive. So the number one challenge is trying to figure out what the adaptive system is, what it looks like, what it means to be a leader in the adaptive system. I think, again, the entrepreneurial system, we know more about it because we studied innovation so much. So we do have information about that. In fact, I was presenting this morning in the research presentation, and there were some innovation people, and I'm like, how dumb, we know all this. This is all innovation. And I said, yes, you know it in innovation, but we don't know it in leadership. So we need to start bringing this into our leadership language to have the conversation around it. The other problem with it is complexity and its tension. So to be able to understand the adaptive system, you have to be thinking more in line with complexity. That's why I think the QUT program is so important, because it's training people to think differently. So we've got to get into more complexity thinking, and that means there are different components of it. So I'll show the next slide here, which is the adaptive response conditions. Now, this may or may not be familiar to you from your studies of complexity, but these are the basic ideas that you're trying to get at. And so you need adaptive pressures and tensions. With the one thing that we discovered about complexity is this: if you know the first model that I put together with Russ and Mary, we had what we were calling enabling leadership. And that's calling our current model. And the QUT faculty have been all over my case because we've been moving this model along, and they're like, what words do we use? How do we teach this? But as we've been doing the empirical research, we've had a lot of discovery. Well, one of the things we discovered was that enabling, at least what we had conceptualized, was not quite right. Because what Russ Marion believed was that in enabling, we would create the conditions. So our thinking behind it was a leader would go in and would create complexity conditions. And in creating complexity conditions, that then would generate the adaptive response that would help the organization. So we went in and studied, I think, 10 organizations at this point, qualitative research for years. So we've been really deep into our empirical research. And in all of that, we never found leaders doing that. So it fell apart. We weren't finding leaders enabling adaptive complexity, or enabling complexity. But what we did find was that complexity occurred when there were pressures. So pressures are what drives complexity. It's a #1 key theme that emerged in our data. And when there are pressures from the environment and certain kinds of pressures, that's what drives complexity. The reality is people don't want to be in complexity. So I'd like to be in complexity. I put myself in it, but not many people are as trained as I am. And so most people are trying to avoid being in complexity because it's stressful and it's uncomfortable. It's not a pleasant situation for them. So it's the same with organizations. They want to stay in stability. They want to stay in equilibrium, but they can't. And it's these pressures from the environment that are the triggers that cause them to have to respond and come up with an adaptive response. So pressures and tensions are critical. And instead of getting rid of them, we need to understand the value and the importance of them. I'm going to go through just a couple more of these. These are kind of technical, but I'll give you the basic ideas. The degrees of freedom for interaction is the idea that we need to have things where it's not overly defined. Too many of our interactions in organizations are overly defined. And so meetings are agenda, and they're controlled and structured. I did some consulting work for an insurance company, and it used to drive me crazy because I would go into the meetings, and even their Q&A was planned ahead. So they would have these sessions that were presentations set up, and they were supposed to be real Q&A, but what they did is they planted people in the audience to ask the questions of the leaders up on the stage. So we do too much controlling and defining of interaction. We need to allow more opportunity for freedom of interaction, because it's the interaction where we can generate the creative response. Interdependency is a critical thing, and interdependency is something that I think we've really not understood very well. When complexity happens, it's a pressure, and that pressure means we have to do something different. So it's a pressure to do an adaptive challenge, not a technical challenge, and not hypothesis work. And so typically what happens with complexity, the pressure comes in, we have to do something different, we can't use a known solution. We typically have a new kind of partnership, and so you see this a lot in the complex projects. There are new people that are brought together, and so it's a new interdependency. And these people have to work together to get something done or they won't survive. They don't have a choice. Believe me, they don't want to do it. They'd much rather not have to work, but because they have to for survival or to get through this, that's the interdependency. And then conflicting constraints means that they have different worldviews. So complexity occurs because all of the different people have different needs, values, worldviews, preferences, all of that, and that gets into conflict. And so again, in traditional leadership, what we've done is we've tried to get rid of conflict. We've tried to smooth it over. We need to learn to operate in it. The tension and the conflict is important. And that's the heterogeneity, the diversity of views. And then catalysts are sponsors. And so sponsors become important because those are the ones that help pull the ideas in the organization.
So if you look at the emergence, and that was in the previous slide, and these is about creating the opportunity for that.
That's right.
I suppose the challenge in a leader's role is how to work with that, because it's, as you say, we tend to shy away from conflict. We tend to shy away from diversity of opinions. As you say, we try and create some order in it. So is there any particular leadership behaviours that you found really helps them manage this tension between the more sort of administrative leadership and more entrepreneurial leadership?
So the pieces that we have right now in our adaptive system, we've got three things that we're thinking about at the moment. One of them is the idea of linking up. And so what we know adaptive leaders in the adaptive system need to do is think about linking up. So this is, to me, a core complexity concept. What complexity is in my mind is you're seeing all these things that are happening out there that if they link up, they're going to generate emergence. They're going to create something different from what was there before. And so it's an aggregation process. So what complexity or adaptive leaders do is they look for those things that can be linked up where they'll create emergence. So that's one thing. The other thing is they might also want to look to see the things they want to stop from linking up to stop the kind of emergence that they don't want. And so the example I always give there is Al-Qaeda. After 9/11 in the United States, when Al-Qaeda attacked the U.S., the number one thing that the government did was went after all of the things that would help them connect and link up. So it went after the resources, it went after the information flows, because it was trying to keep them from connecting. Now, many organizations want to do that, right? They want to control, but the fact of the matter is they can't control in the past. That's how they used to control, to keep things. That's why traditional leadership operated the way it did. But there are things you can do if you're watching for emergence to think about what do you need to not allow to link up. The other thing is conflict, which I've talked about, being comfortable in managing in the conflict. And the work that I find that's the best there is around Heifetz's work. So I don't know if you study Heifetz in your program, but Heifetz is at Harvard, and he's talked quite a bit about, since the early 90s about this. I think he was really an early visionary in understanding. He didn't use complexity, so he did this outside of complexity, but it links up so nicely with it. So he talks about cooking the conflict and the need to, when you've got conflict, adaptation and creativity comes when you've got the right amount. So you want to cook the conflict. You want to turn the heat up to get it more in that zone. So remember my picture of the order and the complexity and the chaos? It's the perfect way of thinking about cooking the conflict. You don't want to be too ordered because you're not going to get the adaptive response. You want to be in the right level. But you don't want the heat to be so high that it boils over. So that's chaos. So you're trying to cook the conflict and keep it in the complexity zone. And then the third thing we've got in the adaptive system is sponsorship. And so there, what happens is, if you think about the entrepreneurial and the administrative, ideas are trying to get up from the entrepreneurial into the administrative system. But we have, in some of my slides, I used to have a picture of a brick wall, but my colleague likes wall of resistance better. But I have this really beautiful brick wall right there. You're trying to push things up in the system and you hit the brick wall. And that's the biggest frustration, is like, how do I get through that? What do I do? And so the only way organizations are really going to be able to be adaptive is if we can break through that brick wall. So you have to try to break some holes in the wall of resistance, and that's where sponsorship can play an important role. How can you find the right person in the formal system that can help get this into the system, and how can those people help pull things through? I think that's just the conclusion after this.
Cool. Okay, so I don't know if there's any questions from the group so far.
I think we can do questions at the end.
So yeah, so if we want to just do a conclusion, it's basically we require a new way of thinking about leadership. Our current language isn't able to capture what we need to address, and that's because it's grounded in traditional models that don't let us get beyond top-down bureaucratic mindsets. So we need a connectionist view. And then complexity offers that. It doesn't dismiss what we know from the past, it builds on it, and it adds a piece of the puzzle that's missing. So I think we're ready for Q&A.
Thank you very much for this, Vicky and Mary. I just would like to put out questions to all the attendees to see if anyone has any questions at this point in time. Please send them through and I will ask them to Vicky and Mary. One of the questions I had actually was, you spoke about the kind of balance between the entrepreneur and the administrative system. How do you manage to create that balance? What do you need to do? What do you need to think about in order to kind of create the balance? So it's not too kind of administrative heavy, but it's, you know, you're not too innovative to the point that you're not being able to implement things correctly.
That's right. So I don't really like the word balance. I don't think I use it. And it's not, it's okay that you used it. It's a word that I think quite a bit about. I don't really think it's about balance between the two. I think it's about the interface. And so that's really the role of the adaptive system. The key thing is that we need to have adaptive systems that are in place that help manage in that interface between the other two. If you're not dealing with complexity, you don't need a complex response. So remember the idea of requisite complexity, that it takes complexity to beat complexity. If you're operating in the ordered regime, you're fine to stay in the ordered regime. So I think the critical thing is to understand where we need the adaptive response and how we're enabling that. But I would also say that almost every organization today needs to be adaptive. And I could go through lists of companies that are threatened to fail right now, major companies that we know that are on the list about ready to die, or ones that probably will die in the next 5 or 10 years, unless they get more adaptive. So if they've gotten really too top-heavy, which is the most common problem, then they need to figure out how to get more adaptive systems and structures in place to try and fuel that entrepreneurial and get it into the formal system. Did that answer it?
Thank you. Yeah, that does answer my question. If anyone has any questions, please send them through.
I guess I had a question. Is it more about having, so in that adaptive space, is that about leaders having an outward-looking view as well as an inward-looking view, or is that something that's important to leaders operating in that adaptive system?
I think they should, but it's not a necessity.
Okay.
So that raises actually another issue, which is the concept of local.
Yes.
So I don't know if you remember this from your study of complexity, but there's a concept of local historical. And what happens is that people operate in their local environment. Now, local doesn't mean that it's not international. It's not a geographic local. It's really more my worldview. So, for example, my local is very international. More so than it is even for Nebraska. I don't have many connections at all in Nebraska or Lincoln. My connections are everywhere else. So my local is that. And so as we operate in our local, then it's inherent that we're going to have the external.
Yeah.
The local is about what we're dealing with in all of this. So we like to draw nice, neat little boundaries around things. Yeah. The world doesn't really operate that way. And so the pressures come into our local. We're constantly dealing with those pressures. So I think adaptive leaders operate in local, and they need to understand that. But if you're an adaptive leader, you're also probably pretty good at understanding that I have my own local, but you have your own local.
Yeah. Right.
So a couple of years ago, we did some research with an organization, a hospital, and we had a Booz Allen grant, so we had 6 hospitals actually we were studying. And my colleague, who's a strategy colleague, was great because she said, I see what's going on here. They're using, the administrators in the hospital are using their local to try to get the doctors on board. So if you know anything about healthcare or hospitals, you've got hospital administrators who are the MBAs, and they're the business people trying to drive business. You've got the doctors who are clinical. You know, they are into healthcare. Well, actually, the nurses and the most.
Yeah.
The doctors are businessmen as well. But the doctors, in many of the cases in the U.S., they're independent contractors. So they don't work for the hospital. Well, the administrators kept trying to use their language of what they were dealing with and their pressures to motivate the doctors to try to get them to do what they wanted done. And it was not working. Yeah. So I was actually in Thailand with a group. We had an executive group. And we're in Bangkok, and it was the top team. So it was the chief operating officer and the chief medical officer and the chief information officer and some other people. And some nurses and some doctors there. And they kept trying, they were so frustrated because they're like, we're doing everything we can, we're bending over backwards for the doctors, and we're trying to get them to come on board. And we don't know what else to do. So there was a doctor in the room who I knew would talk if I engaged him. So I said to him, tell me what you're thinking about what they're saying. And he said, well, I don't agree with this partner thing, because they're using the word partner. And he's like, I'm not your partner. And they looked at him and they said, what the heck are you talking about? You're not our partner? He said, no. Then they'd use our hospital. He'd say, it's not my hospital, it's your hospital. And this is a guy who's their chief of staff, chief medical officer. He's like, not my hospital, your hospital. So we continued to do this. I had to ban the word partner. I had to tell them they couldn't use our hospital. And so we essentially got them to understand they had very different locals. The administrators had no clue what the doctors' locals were. So the doctors were like, we don't want your parties. We don't want you giving us food. What we want is a good facility so when we bring our patients to your facility, we'll be able to get the best care possible for my patient. They wouldn't even agree on our patient because the administrators were saying our patients. They're like, no, my patient. So I think this concept of local is unbelievably important. And it's something we haven't talked about in leadership. And again, complexity brings these new concepts to the table that allow us to think about this differently. But in our local, these pressures are all part of it. So it's not a neat, tidy, internal, external.
Okay.
Thank you very much. I've had a question actually from James Duncan. He has asked, how successful was the delayering of management structures that was also driven by cost considerations?
So how successful was the delayering of organizational structure that was driven by what?
Cost considerations.
By
Cost
consideration. So delayering, okay, I've got to think about this for a minute. Delayering
of management structures.
In part successful, but I think the problem is that they didn't understand what to put in place. So you can delayer, which takes out some of the inefficiencies of bureaucracy, but the problem is that what we haven't been able to understand is how to make an organization a complex adaptive system. So until we understand how to do that and get the adaptive dynamics in, any of these other things are really not going to be able to help us in the long run. So many organizations in the U.S., they're driving for cost cuts. So they drive for execution. Wall Street rewards them and they're cutting out all of this. But the people that I know, the CEOs that I'm working with, they're telling me the problem with that is it's driving out the adaptive. So when you go to an execution kind of model, some of the people who they're cutting out are actually the most adaptive people. One CEO I'm working with in particular who is part of an organization, he's on the board, it's a major company, I won't name it, but they're doing this right now, and he said all the people who are adaptive are the ones they've wiped out as they're trying to do the cost cutting. So I think that it has potential to be good in terms of driving out inefficiency, but you can only do it if you really inject the right kinds of adaptive dynamics along with it.
Thank you very much, Mary. Any other questions? Please send them through.
So what's the question? Oh yes, so the question I sort of wanted to ask Mary was that you've had a lot of conversations with people talking about the different competencies that leaders feel that they need. But we had, asking them what are the old type of competencies they had and what new ones. So can you give? I think for people in the leadership role, it's often really for them to understand their new role. It's really to understand what they need to be doing.
So I'm going to bounce back to you for a minute. What do you think, Vicky, that the old competencies are and what are the new ones that are being asked of you? If you don't mind me putting you on the spot.
No, that's okay. I think the old ones are sort of around coordinating people, a lot of talk about motivating people, but now I hear language like empowering people, engaging people, showing flexibility with people. And I guess I still struggle with the self-awareness because there's a need to have self-awareness, but I guess if you're talking about locals, it's more than just awareness of yourself.
That's right.
So I guess that's what sort of came into my mind.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so what you're saying is the old is the things like directing, controlling, so the things that go along with the industrial age. The fact that the manager is in charge. I think the recognition now is that managers are not in charge. They need to enable what my colleague would say, enable the distributed intelligence in the organization. So it's more, I hear more about coaching more facilitating. Yes. And they use the word empowering. Empowering is okay, but there's some problems with it. Yes. The problem with empowering is that that concept did not work well in hierarchical context. No. So I did my dissertation on self-management, self-managing teams. This was the late 1980s, early 1990s, and so it was the coming of the knowledge era, and self-managing teams were the big thing, and empowerment was a new concept, and I was so excited about it. I really believed in it. And so I watched it as the organizations tried to do the empowerment movement. Yeah. And I would go out and see this young new professor so excited about empowerment. And the managers in the room would just shake their head. Yeah. And I'd say, what's wrong with it? And they'd say, well, you're asking me to empower, to give them more opportunity, but I'm still accountable. Yes. So I can delegate decision-making authority, but I haven't delegated accountability. Yeah. And so, and the people who were on the empowerment bandwagon early on, and many of them got burned because they would go out, I don't know if you remember this, but from the empowerment movement, they would train people, they would get people inside the organization, and then they would go do the training. And so then they could get the ones who were most excited and they'd continue the training. Yes. Well, then it would fall back to what it was, and these people were burned, so they became really cynical. Yes. So this is when we started talking about organizational cynicism as a construct in org behavior, because people became so cynical. So in watching all of this, I'm a passionate believer in the ideas of what empowerment should do, but I knew that there was a problem in our system, that it would never ever work in a hierarchical system. Yes. And that's why I was poised when I was introduced to Russ Marion to talk about complexity. Why it resonated and clicked for me, because I knew we needed a different kind of system and conceptual framework to talk about this. If we're going to get empowerment out there, we've got to have it not in a hierarchical model. Yeah. And so the complexity, the nature of it being connectionist, and the idea of the interactive dynamics, and the idea of the systems really works better for it because we don't get the same kinds of issues around accountability. Mm-hmm. So I think those are the differences in the competencies. A lot of the competencies that you talked about, things about self-awareness, I think self-awareness is great. Yeah. There's no question. But it's not enough. No. And too much of our leadership development is only on self-awareness. So the assumption of that is that it's all in my head. Yeah. And it's not all in my head. We need to understand all these things that are happening out there. So self-awareness is a piece, but we need to understand complexity of thinking. We need to understand dynamics and systems. We need to bring context into this more fully and understand. The way I always describe it when I started doing this work is instead of just me managing you, it's me interacting with a complex dynamic. Yeah. So you and I in interaction, it's a complex dynamic. Yeah. And so I can't predict and control. I need to understand the things that are going on around that. And that's where I think complexity and systems thinking really help us.
I guess just as a leader though, one of the things that is really important, I think, and probably because of my background is communication. But I guess I wonder how you do that with people who work for you and how you communicate that I can't simplify everything, and how do you balance the need or the desire to have things simplified and for order and structure, because for so long organisations have given that to people. How do you get them comfortable with complexity and with change if you're not asking them to make decisions in that area, or are you?
Well, this is where I think we need the paradigm shift. This is why we need a new language and a new understanding for leadership. Because what we've done by teaching hierarchical and socializing people in the hierarchical is we've created dependency models. Yeah. So we've made subordinates dependent on managers. My big gripe in teaching and writing about organizational behavior is when they talk traditionally about motivation, the way we always taught it was, if I'm not motivated, it's my manager's fault. Yes. Well, that's fine. I'm sorry. We need to say, if I'm not motivated, what am I doing? What's wrong with me? What's wrong with my fit with the system around, or with me and my situation? Mm-hmm. Sure, the manager is involved in that, but we need to distribute responsibility more. Yeah. And so I think it's bigger than one person. Yeah. It's about really pushing this shift to get people to understand complexity differently, and to stop training so much in the hierarchical model. Yeah. So I think for your employees, the key thing is to not try to simplify, to let them know that they need to be in tension. You can do that as a manager. You're going to be a fish swimming upstream because not everybody else is going to be doing this. But it is the right thing to do.
So is that about explaining to them the dynamics that you're operating in, rather than, because I imagine it would be quite hard to understand if you don't have the view of everybody else's locals, everything else that's going on. Is it about balancing that in your communication as well?
I think it is about explaining the dynamics. So what happens is that if you're doing a good job of being an adaptive leader, or if you're doing complexity, it doesn't look like traditional management.
Right.
And so many people will say, my leader's not doing anything. And that's not right. If a leader's enabling, or if they're facilitating, fostering, coaching, they're getting the dynamics going. They might even be injecting some stress or tension in dealing with that, or allowing that to play out. From a traditional model, that's not an effective leader. So we've got a big problem here, because the people who are being really effective are not the ones who are being recognized as being the right kinds of leaders, because we're still using old language. We see this all the time. We see complexity leaders who are doing a great job who aren't being understood. So I worked with some consultants, and there was a woman who was telling me about a guy in an organization. This guy is near the top. He's positioned to be the next CEO, I think. And she said that she was talking with him, and he was saying, yeah, I've been advised that I'm not in charge enough. And his boss tries to tell him he's not in charge enough. Well, he's completely facilitated an adaptive response in his organization. The numbers are all there. Everything is there, except what he's doing doesn't look like traditional management. So they don't think he's strong enough. So we need a shift. We really need to get this understood better.
Thanks, Mary. The question I had actually, you talk about a business like enabling a team or enabling individuals to be creative within an organization. I just wanted to kind of point out, like, for instance, Google, they tend to provide their staff with time to, like, thinking time to kind of get together, almost having some kind of incubator hub where a team can kind of get together and kind of formulate ideas and take time out of their daily routine. Is that the kind of thing you think, you know, other businesses should be following, the kind of similar models?
Absolutely. I mean, there are pieces of it out there that we see, and so we know that organizations can do this. We just need to have a better understanding. And it's not a one-size-fits-all. So there are all kinds of different ways that organizations can do this. I think Google is a fascinating example. It's one that I like to use quite a bit. It's fun because if you know Google, a couple of years ago they had a leadership change at the top. So at Google, they traditionally had what they called the triumvirate leadership team. So it was Eric Schmidt in charge, and then Larry Page and Sergey Brin. But I think it was 2 years ago now, I can't remember, 2 or 3 years ago, there was the announcement that Eric Schmidt was stepping down and that Larry Page was taking over. And this was because Google was losing its edge. It was losing its entrepreneurial. With Eric Schmidt in charge, it was, all the bureaucracy was creeping in. And so they recognized it and decided they had to do something, so they pulled him out. I think there's still 3 of them there, but they shifted it. And they brought in Larry Page because he was one of the original entrepreneurs. He was an engineer, and he could speak to the engineering side. And so they were trying to re-inject those kinds of things that would make them entrepreneurial and innovative again. So yeah, I think the key is those kinds of adaptive structures and systems that allow people to engage in those kinds of things that I was talking about. You know, the tension, the heterogeneity, the interdependence around it, and the idea that there's going to be conflicting constraints, and so people need to be comfortable. But also the dynamic interaction, the ability to have the freedom to interact, to say things, to speak up, and not have things be so structured, because the structure is where when you get that, you're driving out that individual creativity. You still need it, but there are times when you need to enable more of the adaptive.
Thank you very much. Well, if we don't have any further questions, I will wrap up here, and I'd like to...
Stephanie? I guess I have one more question as a leader. You talked about that gentleman who's almost at the top of his organisation, very effective, it sounds like, if you're looking at outcomes, but as a process of observing him as a leader, his fellow leaders don't feel that he's doing a good job, essentially. That obviously creates a risk for new leaders who are using more adaptive approaches. How do we manage that?
It's a question I don't have the perfect answer.
Right,
Unfortunately,
yeah.
you know, the big picture is we get people to understand more that this is effective leadership. I think clearly we're in a time of transition. So there still is enough of the remnant of the industrial age and the bureaucratic, so there are plenty of people who still think that way and they're still functioning that way and getting along. There are the other, it's really kind of funny because when I would have audiences, it would be about a 50-50 split. Some people are just right on board with this and they're saying we're not doing enough, so they want me to go even further. And the others are going, you're whacked, I don't get this at all. And so they kind of give you the blank stare, they can even be hostile or resentful about it. So that's the world we live in.
Right.
I think the reality is we've got to understand political systems.
Yeah.
So you've got to manage the politics of it. And one of the things that to me has become really important, and I've always known it was important, but in this work I think political systems, understanding politics is a key thing for being successful. Because if the politics is about the formal system, and the informal, politics is an informal system that arises around the formal, but we know that it's got to do with how you get things in the formal system. Right. So much of this is about that. And so you need to understand political dynamics in terms of how you can get people to go along. You need to be able to influence and persuade. You need to have networks. You need to have connections. You need to know when you can push so far and then have to pull back. You've got to pick your battles. Timing is really essential. So all of these things are skills, but because we are in this world that we're in, you need to have skills for both.
Right.
And so you need to know sometimes I need to put on this other front or this other face. And so it's again about playing on it. Now for people who would say, well, I want to be authentic, the fact of the matter is we can't be totally authentic. I mean, organizational life is that we put on a professional persona. I'm not telling you to be unethical by any means. I'm just saying be smart in terms of understanding. And in systems, we have the ability to resist things. So to me, the challenge of complexity is how can you get a system that's resisting to change? That's kind of the fun of it. Where can I find the hole that I can inject something in here? And so it's about being smart around those things. And if you're too, excuse the word, too cocky about this and too confident in yourself, the system won't chew you up and spit you out.
Right.
So it's being political.
Okay. Being politically savvy.
Yes.
Do you have a comment?
No, it's probably more around, you know, you talked there about the fact that, you know, in the administrative system, it's very much about control. So this is all really about control, isn't it?
Yes,
And power. And where power and control lie. And I think one of the difficulties I think leaders have is actually for them, leadership is synonymous with control.
That's right.
And it's the understanding that they actually, through letting the control go, that's what actually leads to empowerment. That's actually when they're at their most powerful. So I don't know, we've obviously thought about that, where all that fits in.
Well, so I do a lot on power, as you know, and whenever I teach complexity, I teach about power, because unless you understand power differently, you're not going to be able to make the breakthrough to get to complexity. It's really interesting because Mary Uhl-Bien wrote this in the 1920s about power with. And what she was saying was, it's not about power over, it's about power with. But what happened is that in the 1950s, especially when management took off, we had a choice. We could stick with study the informal systems, or we could study the formal systems in management. And we knew about emergence then. We knew about small groups, informal dynamics, all of that. But what happened is that the field of management went down the path of rational, formal management, control-oriented. And so everything became about control, and that's the power over model. And that model worked for a while. But anybody who's working with millennials right now, with the young generation, power over doesn't work very well with them. Yeah. And that problem's only going to get worse. And the reason that power over isn't working anymore is because people have more sources of power. So in the past, you could control the sources of power by having control over information, by having control over decision making, by dictating what people did in their work. None of that's there anymore. I mean, the number one thing that's not there is control over information.
Yes.
But employees that aren't necessarily allowing control over either older generations that are socialized in hierarchical thinking, yes, but the younger generation's really not going there. And the other people who won't go there is the talent. So the war for talent, people have options. In the old days, it was lifetime employment. And so we were the good soldiers. We all went into good soldier syndrome. But now people have more opportunity, more flexibility. All of that has changed the nature of power. So we've got to understand power with rather than power over, and we have to understand the importance of personal power instead of just position power. It doesn't mean position power isn't important, and if you have it, you have to use it effectively. But you've really got to learn to build more personal power, which is more influence.
So do you think then a critical skill of leaders is that informal networking, that knowing if you're going to break through that wall, if you're an innovator, finding those people in the organisation to connect to, but also maybe external to the organisation as well?
And that's networking.
Yeah.
So, you know, we've seen networking boom in the management field. It's a huge area now. And not only in the academic side, but also in the practice side. So networks, and complexities essentially a network theory.
Right.
So really the networks are more important than ever. They always have been, but again with the nature of networking and the way that we network now and social networking and all of the information available, there are more opportunities to do these kinds of things. So networking is essential.
Yeah. But I guess it's the value that you get out of that network as opposed to building up a LinkedIn profile with a huge number of connections. It's about the depth or the value.
But the network research has historically shown the strength of weak ties.
Right.
So the idea of networking would be that they went into it thinking, oh, you need to have a strong network of all these strong connections.
Yes.
That's not the way it works. What they found was that it's the weak ties. Now, this doesn't mean with your coworkers.
Right.
So we're not talking about the people you're working with closely. We're talking about these broader networks.
Okay.
And so weak ties are what's really important. And actually, the best networkers don't have too many of them. It's also not about the size of your network. And if you're good at networking, what you understand is that it's the small world theory. So it's just a couple steps to get to another one.
Yes.
So and what I've found in my own experience is sometimes you can have one person you link up with that you get all the access to their network.
Yeah.
Just because you know that person, now you're friends with everybody. You all know the friends of everybody else.
Yeah.
And so it's about those kinds of connections and finding your way through. The other thing, and I spent a lot of time talking about this in my own research, is the idea of reciprocity and social exchange theory in relationships. But reciprocity and understanding how to manage that is really important. Many people get turned off by it because they think, oh, it's favor exchange. But the bottom line is we live our lives in social relationships, and social exchange relationships are based on reciprocity. That's the fundamental element of it. And so if it's not a reciprocal exchange, we won't continue in it.
Yeah.
But you can ask me to do something. The nature of that is that you are now indebted to me.
Yes.
It's not because I say you're indebted. This is the nature of human interaction. And so reciprocity in social exchange theory says as soon as that occurs, there's an indebtedness or an obligation. So if you ask me for a favor and I do it for you, now I know I can ask you for a favor and you're going to do something back. And I can't tell you how many times that's worked for me. I mean, I ended up in Sweden quite a bit. Well, that happened because I'd asked Matt Allison to come to a conference and he doesn't go to the conference. Then he doesn't know me at all. He didn't know me at all. About a year later, he writes me and says, I need to do something in the Academy of Management Review and I don't know how to do this. Can you help me? I had so much stuff to do, and I'm like, I gotta do this. So I did it for him. Luckily, it was a quick one, quicker than I thought. And so then he invited me to Sweden, and then I went over a couple times. I had tremendous learning. I have all these connections there now. So it's understanding the nature of exchange and reciprocity and how it can work for you.
Okay, cool. Stephanie, I think we might hand back to you now.
Thank you very much, Davina. Well, thank you all for attending this webinar today for Leadership for a Complex World. I'd like to thank QUT MBA Director Vicky Browning for chairing the interview, and I'd like to thank Professor Mary Uhl-Bien for delivering a fantastic webinar, really insightful about leadership in a complex world, particularly that struggle between administrative and entrepreneurial, I thought was really interesting, and that there is no balance, but the struggle basically creates creativity. I thought that was fascinating. And, you know, in terms of leadership, it needs to enable and it needs to be flexible and adaptable. And I think that's something we can all take away from this. So thank you all. I will be sending through the presentation, and I will be sending through a link to the webinar for you all to listen back. But I'd like to wrap this webinar up and thank you all. And also just to note that there will be a webinar coming up on the 23rd of July on technological literature for sustainable technologies. That's between 1 and 2 p.m. BST. So thank you, and I will close this webinar now. Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks for that.